Ori and the Blind Forest is a game that you really struggle to find anything bad to say about it. The developers at Microsoft Studios created a platformer that left a huge impression on players. Ori and the Will of the Wisps greatly builds upon its predecessor in such a way that it genuinely feels like a much different and improved upon sequel. With greater breadth, details, choice, and diversity than ever, it all accumulates to make an unforgettable game. For today, we're going to be talking about that very sequel, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and it has been out for a while, but I just managed to complete the game recently, so I wanted to talk about it and make a video on it. So now, we're going to be talking about the basic stuff of the game, then moving on to the actual gameplay, how it plays, how it feels playing it, and then talking about things to know about the game going into it, and then the very few negatives that I had about the game. And trust me, it was really hard to find any negatives about the game. Like I said, right now we're just going to be talking about some general information about the games, things such as graphics, animation, sound design, story, things along those lines. In terms of visuals and graphics, if Ori and the Blind Forest was a visually stunning game, then this is absolutely beautiful to look at. It's such a good, well put together background design, whether it's graphics involving Ori or the enemies, everything is so visually stunning that it's just, sometimes you have to sit there in the loading screen just looking at all the designs, or when you're in game just absorbing everything in the environment that's around you. It's such a graphically and visually great game to look at. The graphics and visuals also kind of bleed into the animation side of things. Animation and art are great, whether it's the background, Ori fighting, or even the enemies that you're battling. The animations are god tier, if I have to say, especially for boss battles. The background, what the bosses are doing, every minor detail is just so well put together that it's just a visual spectacle and one of the best looking games that you can find out there. Now moving on to audio, the soundtrack, and the sound design, the music side of the game is absolutely phenomenal. Audios in terms of fighting, other objects surrounding the environment, etc. are pretty spot on as well, and just sitting there in the environment, kind of mentioned this talking about the graphics, but just sitting anywhere throughout the map, just listening into the music, and then just taking in the surrounding environment, it's kind of its own spectacle in a way. So for the audio side of things, it's absolutely great. This next topic is somewhat of a gameplay mechanic, but it's also somewhat basic in its essential core. The story of the game. Now the story is a little different from Ori and the Blind Forest. You're essentially trying to save your friend who had some very unfortunate circumstances. I'm not going to go too much into spoilers if you do decide to get the game or you are playing the game, but the story is simple but sweet and straight to the point. There's really not much to say else about the story, but I did like it for what it was. Of course, Ori and the Will of the Wisps and a high caliber developer in Microsoft Studios are expected to have those basic components honed in and fine-tuned as a 10 out of 10. Because there are games out there where sequels, or even not even necessarily sequels, but other games are such a letdown because they mess up one of these key components to the game. And of course, this accumulates to make a genuinely fun game. You can really see that they've built upon the previous game in Ori and the Blind Forest, using other games such as Hollow Knight as a model for its base. And having expanded in areas such as combat, it really enhances the feel of the gameplay, which I will get into shortly. Moving on to the gameplay side of things, we're going to be talking about how does this game feel when you're playing it. And now, one of the first things that I noticed while starting Ori and the Will of the Wisps straight away is that it does feel like a different game compared to Ori and the Blind Forest when you really look at it closely. It kind of has a different feel to it, and it of course has a different way of playing it compared to Ori and the Blind Forest. Now there are similar mechanisms that are included, but it does feel and have different kind of components and features that makes the gameplay feel different. One of the new features that make the gameplay of Ori and the Will of the Wisps feel the same but also drastically improved has to be the combat side of things. There's so much more combat abilities that you have to consider it a complete overhaul. Sure, the orb that helped you in Ori and the Blind Forest is still there, but you're not as reliant as you were in the previous game on it. as you are more reliant on your other abilities. It's really cool having essentially a lightsaber and other awesome abilities help you out as you progress throughout the game. You can tell that the combat definitely does have a quick and slashy feel, where you can see games such as Hollow Knight coming in as a model, as giving that feel that if you're not really paying attention to the minor details in your battle, you're gonna die. This next feature I definitely felt almost immediately going into Ori and the Will of the Wisps. One can argue that Ori and the Blind Forest was a challenging game, but it was easy to learn and execute moves. In Ori and the Will of the Wisps, there is some real skill needed to take out certain enemies and definitely needed in boss battles. Also, there's some serious skill needed for certain moves around the map. Learning is required in this game. Now, this is the kind of game where it's easy to learn the basic components of how to move around, how to take out enemies, but it's definitely hard to master, which is the same as its predecessor, but I just felt that this game was a lot more challenging, that there were parts that I was genuinely stumped on. I have been mentioning boss battles and encounters, so I kind of wanted to quickly talk about that. The boss encounters, there aren't that many, but the ones that they do have are really well done and flow greatly. It's an actual real challenge that there were some boss battles where I genuinely had to rage quit and then think out what I'm gonna do throughout my day and how I'm gonna beat that certain boss battle, which is great to see. And it does still have that aspect of some boss encounters where it has that chase scene and then leading up to the boss battle, which is still great to see. Lastly, one of the great aspects of the gameplay that I loved has to do with the environment of the game, your background and your surrounding. The environment that you're in, whether it's in the starting part of the game, the middle, or the end, wherever you are throughout the map, I don't want to give out too many spoilers, that's why I'm not really naming places. It genuinely feels alive and that it's working against you. But there are some vivid and cool things to do which allow everything to work together. And then the environment is just, like I said in the basic info, it's stunning and it's great to look at, and I absolutely love it. Overall, my thoughts on the gameplay is that I loved it. I really liked what they did with the new combat mechanisms and features. It really feels like Ori and the Blind Forest, like I said at the very start of the gameplay section, but different and improved upon, which is great. I really loved being in different parts of the map and feeling like I am also in that environment as well, which is great. So now we're going to be moving on to another section called Things to Know. And now this is a section talking about things to know before going into the game that can make your gameplay a lot more smoother, and just important things to know before you buy the game and going into it, like I said. The first feature I wanted to talk about isn't necessarily all that important as it pertains to side quests, because a lot of side quests in other games really don't feel like there is a complete need to do them other than getting achievements or just getting really unique items. But side quests in Ori and the Will of the Wisps can actually have a meaning if you choose to do it, as they're really good rewards if you do get them. There is now a village hub, which is essentially a safe zone in the map, where you can come and enhance your abilities with these cute creatures and also build upon as you go throughout the game, obtaining certain items from side quests, and you can build upon the village, and it's extremely satisfying to see the village start out as a really hostile environment into the end of the game where it looks vibrant and has life in it. This also adds a new layer to the game that you just love. Revisiting areas isn't just for side quests, but coming into an old area with brand new abilities does add a sense of adventure and stuff to do, because there are certain areas where you get a side quest and you necessarily don't have the abilities to quite complete that quest. So it's extremely satisfying going into the beginning part of the game with brand new abilities. It does add also another different feel to the game as well. There are parts where I generally felt stumped on this, and this came as a surprise because I personally didn't feel like that with Ori and the Blind Forest. In Ori and the Blind Forest, there are parts where I felt stuck on, but if I really put my mind to it, I generally found a solution pretty easily. But with this game, I literally quit the game because I couldn't figure out certain parts of the game and problems I had, whether it was a boss battle or figuring out what move I had to do or how to make that jump, or an environmental problem, which is great, and it adds to the challenging factor of the game, which I think it makes the game a lot more challenging. And I love this side of things because it makes the game a lot more challenging and gives you a greater sense of reward and feeling when you do figure out the solution to your problems in the game. Now, this next change in the feature I actually found quite significant is that checkpoints don't work like it did in the previous game, which originally I found quite annoying, but you do get used to it and it adds to the challenging factor of the game. The last topic I wanted to talk about for this section is the topic surrounding progression. Progression in this game feels generally rewarding to the point that later on in the game, the entire flow, gameplay wise, changes up to all the new added combat abilities, which is great. That is what I expect real progression in a game to feel like. Saying that, that is the last feature I wanted to talk about for this section. I hope some of these do make your gameplay flow a lot smoother, and a lot of these I do think are quite significant changes and good things to know. Now we're going to be moving on to the negative sides of things, which honestly I am a pretty harsh gamer when it comes to reviewing or judging games, but in this case I really struggled to find features or parts of the game that I hated about it, so there's not too much to say about the next section, but there are a couple things I did want to mention. But there are a few points that I did want to point out. You can see what I mean by struggling to find harsh negatives or something I disliked about Ori and the Will of the Wisps by my first negative point, if you can call it that, and that has to deal with bugs. I did run the game on the PC version and I did encounter every now and then a few frame drops, so that came from my misconception that this game actually is pretty heavy to run on your computer well, so you may encounter frame drops. I'm not too sure if you're going to find that on the console, but definitely for the PC. And there are a few technical bugs every now and then, but I think there's not too many to the point where you should be concerned about, so I think you can really overlook this part of the game. The next point has to deal with the story. I did say the story was good and charming, and don't get me wrong, I really liked the story for what it was, but I'm not too sure. It felt kind of cheap that one of the main villains, yet again, is another owl, but in this game, it's a petrified owl that looks kind of wonky. Like, is that really the best you can come up with? Don't get me wrong, it's a good villain, but there were points throughout the story where I felt like, who's the main villain here? There were some parts of the game where I felt like the owl wasn't the main focus. Like, there were several other villains as well, which is fine, but I don't know, I just felt like in terms of the quality of villains, I think they could have done maybe a little better. But I don't know, that's just a personal opinion of mine. The next point comes from several reviews I was reading on Steam about Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and this has to deal with the aspect of changing difficulty in the game. There are players out there, and that I have noticed as well by tinkering around with the game, playing around it, is that changing the difficulty doesn't necessarily do all that much, especially when you're changing normal to hard. All that really does is change the length of battles, really. Especially you can see that in boss battles where they don't get any particular harder. It's the same movements, everything. It just becomes a little longer. There's really no point to play on hard difficulty unless you're just doing the achievement. That's really the only reason you're going to be doing with. In terms of difficulty, the differences between them, there's really not too much, which is something I was kind of disappointed with. Coming up with some of these negatives, and there are a few that I haven't mentioned because it just feels like I'm grasping at thin air, like I'm going so much of a stretch to criticize a game when some of these points don't really matter too much. If you hate platformers where it's hard to master certain abilities in a game with ridiculously hard boss battles and enemies, then of course platformers in this game is not going to be for you. And if you do hate it and you hate these kind of games going into it, you're going to have so many more negatives. Then like I said, this may not be the game for you. Those are most of the negatives that personally I had with the game and that I could come up with. If you look at the Steam reviews, there are a couple other people that had some, I don't know, some good points, but I just think you could overlook it, honestly. So now I'm just going to give my ending thoughts about what I really think overall about Ori and the Will of the Wisps. In my own opinion, a sequel of a game should be better than its predecessor, the original base game, because it means that game was popular enough to even get a sequel. This sequel is definitely one of those that surpasses its previous game, expanding the combat with beautiful visuals, animations, and sound design mixed together as a platformer flows extremely well with a simple and cute story. This is a great platformer that is easy to learn for new players going into platformers, but hard enough to master for more experienced platforming players. I really recommend that you try this game out for yourself if you're into these kind of games. So for these reasons, I'm going to give Ori and the Will of the Wisps a 9.5 out of 10. So that kind of concludes and wraps up more or less everything I had to say of Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I really enjoyed the game and what it had to offer, and I encourage you to get it and let me know in the comments below what you guys thought about the game as well. I tried not to show too many spoilery gameplay footage, that's why I kind of showed only kind of early gameplay stuff, apart that one scene from the beginning, which I thought it wasn't too spoilery, but I don't know. I do have some other reviews on this channel as well if you want to check them out. It's a quite variety of reviews of different types of games, so if you do, I will link some of those in the note cards of this videos, and I encourage you guys to check it out. But saying that, I hope you guys did enjoy this review. If you did, comment below if you get the game or not. Let me know how you guys enjoy it. And thanks again for watching this review. And I would definitely see you guys in the next one. And I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks, and I'll see you guys later.